Good afternoon. I was going to start with the obligatory "I'm not a lawyer" statement, because I'm not, but you did it for me, so I appreciate that. So, I'm an IT guy, so I consider myself an op-ed in a room full of peer-reviewed academic journal articles here. So maybe with that context, judge me accordingly. So I think what I'm going to do is try and frame the conversation a little bit around what I'd like for you guys to walk away with, tell you a little bit about myself and the framework in which I work, and then try and build a bit of a picture of how we think about kind of in creating solutions, writing software, developing, helping solve problems and develop solutions, how we think about doing that within the framework of regulation, privacy, cost benefit, and kind of try to build a picture of that. So I think really what I'm trying to do is look at it from the micro perspective. We've looked a lot at the macro perspective, kind of the global perspective, and I'm going to try and bring a little bit of a flavor of what it's like, when we talk about Facebook and the algorithms, some of the decisions that might happen within Facebook as to whether or not an algorithm gets developed or not, which I believe I'll leave to you guys to figure out how that then relates to the macro and in aggregate, but hopefully that provides a little bit of perspective. So I work for an IT consulting firm, a multinational IT consulting firm that's a joint venture between Accenture, who some of you may or may not have heard of, and Microsoft. And what we do is we go into Fortune 500 companies and talk with them about what business problems they may have and figure out how we can help them solve those business problems using technology. So I actually work within the IT organization of the IT organization. So I'm an IT guy for IT guys. So the perspective that I'm coming from, and I'm going to try and build a bit of the decision tree that I think can be extrapolated in other scenarios, but the perspective that I come from is I've got two teams. So I have a team of the folks that fix laptops. So we were in 26 countries in the world. We've got 50 folks that sit in offices and fix people's laptops. So that in and of itself incorporates international labor law and how do we let people go and otherwise. So there's an aspect to that. But I think what's more interesting for this conversation is I also work in partnership with our HR organization to help look to measure, quantify, and improve our employees' experience within Avanade. Try to affect attrition, try to understand why people may be leaving, why people stay, do we have the right skills in the workforce, which you can imagine then leads into some interesting conversations around the data that we're collecting about our people. I don't remember who it was that said that corporations' data is their currency, and I think I would argue that that's true, except the data that we have is really your data. Similar to Facebook, it's their currency. The data we have of our employees is really our employees' data. So when we operate in multiple countries, we're subject to things like GDPR. Is everyone familiar with GDPR? Raise a hands if you are. Okay. So the way that we look at it is, there's regulation at the country level. The GDPR is at the European Union level. And it's right now the most strict set of regulations. So when we think about doing something, we look at that as kind of our guiding light, and in terms of the most stringent regulations, and go forward from there. So all that said, the perspective I'm going to come from today is not from Avanade. I'm coming from an IT leader within Avanade. So anything that I say, I think that we have a really great open dialogue around these questions and these problems within Avanade. But as a disclaimer, I'm not speaking on behalf of Avanade. I'm speaking on behalf of Simon here. It's an important distinction. So I think, to start with, I think it'd be helpful to start with some definitions. So, and the reason that I think that's important is because I think that lawyers and law and engineers and software, I think we speak literally two different languages. I think when we work with regulations that, laws and regulations are written by lawyers in legalese, a derivative of English, that is an attempt to create boundaries around behavior of what something should, and keep me honest here, this is an IT guy's perspective on what lawyers do. And on the flip side, technology and software is written by engineers in code in an attempt to solve a problem or present a solution. So, in each of those frameworks, it's important to have a translator so that when those solutions are developed, they're developed in a way that conforms to the regulations, and the regulations are written in a way that enable technology to conform with that. So that's why I want to start with some definitions in order to frame this conversation. This is by no means exhaustive of the stuff that we're talking about here, but I think these are sort of the principles by which we think about making decisions. So in this context, IT is a catch-all, right? In this context, I'm speaking from my perspective of doing something within a large enterprise for our employees, but I think that could be extrapolated a bit larger to where when I talk about IT and this framework, it's about building something with technology to solve a problem or to provide a capability. So again, in the context of Facebook, we've talked about the algorithms of presenting news. I consider that IT. Somebody wrote that algorithm for a particular need. They're doing something with technology to solve a problem or present a capability to someone. And data, and actually maybe I'll reverse these. So data security is fundamentally for us, it's the space in which we ensure that sensitive data doesn't get in front of the wrong eyeballs. This is it's pretty tactical for us, data security. Do we have the right rules on the firewall and the network to make sure that nobody can intercept data? Is your hard drive encrypted? It's very tactical. Let's make sure the data stays within the boundaries of our ecosystem. And then we think about data privacy in a little bit more of a strategic way. Namely, it's the space in which decisions about what data we collect are made and also what we do with that data once we collect it. So it's a little more gray. It's less tactical and it's a little more strategic. And there's regulations to help guide that, and that's what we have to work within. And as we've talked about, some of those regulations have not quite caught up, and that also is the framework we work within. So, I think in all of this, there exists a healthy tension between the regulation and the technology. And the idea is, I think, that we want to all come to a common goal, so don't look too hard at this slide because I think the analogy breaks down if you try and analyze it too deeply. So it's more of I'm a very visual person, so it's a way for me to kind of frame up the way in which we think about making decisions. And I'm going to do it in a way that we'll take a couple of examples and kind of work through it. So again, this is the micro perspective. This is like the things that get done, the Facebook algorithms, the attrition analytics. We were just talking about predicting when someone may die. We actually have a project internally, a little less morbid, but it's equally as powerful, where we're looking at what are the inputs that might predict whether someone's going to leave or not. Because so again, there's an idea that comes into this, and we have a data privacy or security review process, effectively, that's a series of questions that those questions are dictated in some partnership between the lawyers that wear the red ties and the IT folks that wear the green pants, in an attempt to understand what we're trying to do. And those questions and that process, depending upon how deep the partnership is between the lawyers and the IT group, those questions might be a little bit more skewed towards an increased pace of change, so we want to make sure we're going fast and we're enabling, or it might be skewed in the other direction towards risk mitigation. So we're asking all the questions in the world, and there's a happy balance in there. Or I think some would argue that there's a bit of the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle of moving fast and mitigating risk. Can you have both at the same time? Is kind of a question that we ask a lot. But fundamentally, there's a series of questions that are asked. So we'll take that attrition analytics. We want to collect a bunch of information on our employees and try to predict when they're going to leave. So let's ask questions about, like, is it anonymized? Is it pseudonymized? What countries are you collecting that data in, et cetera? And then that information is used to then make a decision at sort of at the leadership level as to whether or not we should do something based upon the risk that it presents and the positive outcome that comes from that. And decision is made, and then rinse and repeat. So you can imagine there's a lot of externalities into what goes into the questions in this data and security review process. So regulation being a big one. I feel like an anecdote that's interesting to share is, when we think about, I'll just continue to use the attrition analytics example. When we think about doing that, the countries in which we collect data on people is directly related to how stringent the regulations are in those countries. So I think, while that's a micro example, you could potentially, zoom out a little bit and say that the regulations of individual countries might dictate the pace of change and the stuff that's happening in those countries. And over a period of time, what does that affect? And for us, there's particular countries in the EU that have workers' councils. And a workers' council is effectively a union in a particular industry that, depending upon the country, you may be required to come to and present basically an overview of what you're looking to do, and they approve or they deny it. So when we look to do something kind of new and innovative, we usually exclude the set of countries where there's high friction in order for us to understand and prove the concept out. And if indeed it's valuable, we might expand into those countries, we might not, right? So we can take another example. Let's see here. So let's see, where are my examples? There we go. So another one that was in the news recently, and this is more on the security side, was Facebook had a database of passwords that were in clear text. You guys probably read about that. That's an interesting one because I don't know the inner workings of Facebook, but I would argue that in that case, the process by which the team that built that database had to go through was probably biased towards pace of change rather than risk mitigation. So they missed something in there. It wasn't malice. It wasn't the evil Facebook entity deciding that they didn't care about your password. It was a breakdown in that sort of that microcosm of a decision tree that happens whenever we want to do something. So I think, in an attempt to get us back on track on time, I can wrap up here as well. And I think, every good presentation ends in a call to action, and I think I honestly wish you would have just left that Dilbert cartoon up on the screen, because I think it's super applicable. Where, if you look at this decision tree, there's a cascading number of relationships that go into the ultimate decision. So the security review process, what decisions we decide, what questions we decide to collect, what information we decide to collect when we're trying to do something, is based upon a relationship between the legal team and the IT team, and deciding what's relevant, what's not relevant, how do we ask that question. And if you get that wrong, you end up in the Dilbert situation where it takes too long, and you can imagine that the people that want to do interesting things and move quickly end up leaving because they're not enabled to do their best work. But on the flip of that, right, if the relationship is skewed in the other direction, you don't effectively mitigate risk, and you have a database full of passwords and clear text that get leaked, which is a problem. So, and then building on top of that, when that information is collated and presented to, say, the CIO or the Chief Information Officer, the Chief Information Security Officer in an organization, depending upon the relationship between his or her advisors from the IT organization and also the legal organization, the decision as to whether the risk is worth the reward is based upon the relationship between the IT organization and the legal organization and what kind of counsel they're giving to that individual making the decision. And then ultimately, the individual that's making the decision, or the group of individuals that's making the decision, is based upon the cultural kind of stance of the organization. Is it an organization that has a high risk appetite or a low risk appetite? Is it an organization that values innovation over risk mitigation? And that, again, is a relationship between the IT organization and the legal organization ultimately. So I think the call to action is I think both sides of the aisle should be fluent in each other's discipline. So I think it's important for technologists that want to do interesting things with data, in a very general sense, to understand what barriers, what roadblocks, what regulations exist in order to get to the ultimate goal, and vice versa when those regulations and that law is translated into technology terms, that's done in a technologically fluent way, so the pace of change can continue to match the need. So there you have it.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
We're going to have some Q&A after Professor Ashar is done. He's going to get, 15 minutes, right? So we'll have
I want to put some time for Q&A.
But I want to take you from the micro to the macro.
Sure.
I know you don't speak for Avanade.
Right.
For site, right? But the term you used, which I zeroed in on, was you excluded high friction resistance to new ideas and innovations in those countries that have this organized union stuff going on.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, so it's I think it's, when you say what's that all about, maybe let's pull on that thread.
Well, I'm teasing you a little bit.
Yeah.
It's the lawyers.
It's
the lawyer. Well, I think one of the overarching ideas that works into today's discussions has to do with, how do you redefine democracy in terms of the decision-making that affects people's lives in the information age. And as we've discussed earlier, some of the old models and concepts don't apply. So when you said that, that there's a kind of an avoidance of those areas where there's high resistance, it struck me that that might be interpreted as fundamentally anti-democratic in terms of excluding the possibility to innovate in settings where people might not like what you're doing or might put up resistance to what you're doing.
It's an interesting thread to pull on. I think my response to that would be, the decision to do that is a pragmatic one. It's not a philosophical one. So we're building a model that, again, taking that kind of attrition analytics example, we're trying to build a model using AI that takes a number of factors into consideration and tries to predict tries to pull on what the leading causes of people leaving are so that we can fix that and we can improve the employee experience. You could also, from the flip side of that, say from a pessimistic perspective, say we're collecting a bunch of data, but what you do with that, I think, is the important part, right? So if we end up collecting a bunch of data and we can predict when an individual leaves, what do we then do with that? We could either improve their experience or the experience of if we can't individualize them, of people in a similar profile so that they have a better employee experience and they don't leave. Or you could imagine a negative scenario where we use that data to single out that individual and create a hostile work environment, which is what data privacy regulations is, one of the things that they attempt to prevent is retaliatory or negative, hostile workplace in the workplace environment. But in order for us to build that model, we have to use real data. We can't use representative data. So in order to do that, we need some subset of countries to train the model and see if we're even on the right track and whether we should continue to invest in it. So in that case, we see, and I do have to be a little bit careful about specifics, but we see it taking months, if not longer, in order to get through some of those reviews in order to use individuals from those particular countries' data to do something. So the approach that we take is, well, let's go prove the model out before we invest the time and, frankly, money that's involved in going through those review processes. And if we believe we've got a good model, let's go through and let's trudge through those processes. Does that make sense?
You're looking for the right laboratory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.